Hello again, and welcome again to microeconomics. Today we're going to take on a kind of a more realistic approach to industrial organization. We've been talking about two different types of industrial organization, that is, way industries are organized, both of which are important for us to understand, but they're not very frequently occurring. The first one we talked about was perfect competition, and that one is a very important one because it kind of places a yardstick. It gives us a measuring standard for all the others. Turns out perfect competition is as efficient as is possible from the standpoint of society as a whole. Probably not an industry you'd want to be in, however. On the other extreme is perfect monopoly, which is what we talked about last time. It's the best of all worlds because you have complete and total control over things. But again, doesn't occur all that frequently. Probably occurs more frequently than perfect competition, but not as frequently as we would expect it to. What we're going to look at today is the one that is the most frequently occurring one. It's the one that most businesses find themselves in. Most businesses find themselves in monopolistic competition. And so when a business person talks about competition, this is precisely what he means, and most industries fall into this category. So first off, what are the characteristics of a monopolistically competitive industry? First off, there are many producers with very low barriers to entry. So both of those are characteristics. If you're wondering about the name, you'll notice that it's kind of a combination of the two that we've already seen. So there are parts of this that are kind of monopoly-like, and there's parts of these that are kind of competition-like. The first two characteristics, the many producers and the low barriers to entry, should remind us of perfect competition. Remember that in perfect competition we had lots of producers and we had no barriers to entry, so that's at least a portion of what we saw in competition. However, where things begin to get a little bit different is that in the case of monopolistic competition, each producer has a slightly different product. They differentiate their product or try to make it slightly different. To the extent that they're able to differentiate their product, they face a downward sloping demand curve. So unlike the monopolists, they're not completely in charge of their price, but they have more control over their price. And if they can convince you that they're significantly different, then they have complete control over their price, and so they're price makers. Each one of the individual producers acts independently. They act in a fashion that doesn't regard what goes on with the other members of the industry, which is more of what we saw in the perfect competition model and less of what we'll see in the next model that we look at. So how do they differentiate their product? Well, there are lots of different ways of doing that. Physically, it's possible to do it by changing the appearance of the product, making it a different color, a different shape, guaranteeing that it has some sorts of attributes that you don't see in other products. They could differentiate their product by changing the quality of the product. That is, oftentimes in many industries we see some products that are considered to be the higher priced product, the product with more options on it, the product that is more expensive. They also can differentiate their product by location, by putting it in a different place. So if you look at a gas station that's close to the interstate versus a gas station that's close to a neighborhood, they're basically selling the same product, that is gas, but they're selling it at two different locations, and so there's a locational difference. They oftentimes also differentiate their product by providing different services. So we would anticipate seeing a whole different set of services at a department store than what we would see at a discount store. And so that difference in services makes them seem as if they're not the same product. They're products in different places, in terms of your thinking. They also try to differentiate their product based on product image through either promotion or advertising. Now remember that in the two previous industry types that we've seen, there really was no reason for you to advertise. In the case of a perfect competitor, it didn't make sense to advertise because it increases your price and you can sell all you can produce anyway, so it really didn't, or it increases your cost, and you can't recover that through price, and you can sell all you want anyway. In the case of a monopolist, there's not really any incentive for you to advertise either, because you're the only one making the product. So as a result, it really doesn't make sense for you to advertise it. And oftentimes, if you'll note, on monopolies such as utility companies and that sort of thing, while they do some advertising, typically the advertising isn't related to the product. It's not intended to change your idea about the product. It's intended to change your idea about the company instead. As a result, to the extent that they're able to convince you that their product is unlike any other product, then they are very similar to a monopolist. And so they face a downward sloping demand curve with a marginal revenue curve which slopes more quickly. Now, all firms have the same sorts of looks to their average total cost and their average variable cost curves and to their marginal cost curves, because all of those are really dependent on physical characteristics. And they don't change with industrial types. The only thing that changes is a difference in how revenues accumulate. So once again, we're looking for that point. In all industries, we're looking for that point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, because that's our best possible point. And then we go up to the demand curve to determine what the price would be. We could have three different possibilities. If price was greater than average total cost at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, then we'll be making an economic profit. If average total cost is greater than price, but the price is greater than average variable cost, then we're in the loss minimization case. That is, we're making an economic loss. In the short run, we would produce. In the long run, we won't be able to sustain that. And finally, if price is less than average variable cost, then we're incurring an economic loss, and that's the shutdown point. Reminder that in the middle case, in the loss minimization case, from an accounting standpoint, we might very well be able to operate at that point. Even though we're suffering an economic loss, our economic loss might simply be the loss of payment for the resources that we have provided, that is the implicit cost. And so as a result, it is entirely possible that we could operate in the loss minimization case, at least for a short period of time. So let's look at two real possibilities here. In panel A, you see here, they're actually producing and making an economic profit. So the optimum quantity occurs at point E. That's the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. We'll want to produce a quantity of Q output. We go up to the demand curve, and at point B, we see that our price should be P. At that quantity of output, our costs are at C. So the difference between B and C is the amount of profit, the amount of economic profit, not normal profit, but economic profit that we make per unit. And we're making Q units, so the area you see shaded in blue is an economic profit. This is the best of all possible worlds, and if this looks very much like the perfect monopoly model, that's because it is very much like the perfect monopoly model. And again, to the extent that these firms are able to convince you that their product is the only product, then they are monopolist. So if you believe that this particular brand of jeans is the only possible brand of jeans you would ever want to buy, then you make them into a monopolist. Another possibility is in frame B here. In frame B, we're having an economic loss, or we're loss minimizing. Once again, the optimum quantity of output is a quantity of output at the intersection of marginal revenue, marginal cost, which is point E. So once again, we're going to manufacture Q of these, and we're going to charge a price of, we go up to the demand curve, and that occurs at point B. So we're going to charge once again a price of P. The cost at that quantity of output is all the way up at the intersection with points at point C. So the cost is C. The price that we receive is P. C is greater than P, so we're losing money on these. We're losing by the difference between C and P, or the difference between C and B, whichever you'd like to call that. However, we would want to operate there because we're covering all of our fixed cost plus a portion of our variable cost. So that means that it's more expensive for us to shut down than it is to operate. We are losing money, but we lose more money if we simply close up and go home because the fixed costs are greater than what our loss is. So the loss is actually the red shaded area there, red being the appropriate color for that. And the difference between A and B is nothing more than where the demand and the marginal revenue curves occur. In frame A here, the demand curve is above the average total cost curve. In frame B, the demand curve is between the average total cost curve and the average variable cost curve. And so as a result, we incur a loss, and so we're loss minimizing. So the only difference between these two is what's going on with the revenues. There's not any difference in terms of the cost of these two. In the short run, you could make an economic profit. The result of that, however, would be that you would attract new firms to the market. Remember that in this case, unlike the monopolist, we have low barriers to entry, which means almost anyone can come in. One way of thinking of this is if you were to open a small stand that sold Cokes and water and all of that sort of thing at the beach, at least to begin with, you would make a tremendous amount of profit until other people noticed how much money you were making, and then they would decide, well, why don't I do the same thing? When that happens, it draws customers away from your firm and reduces the demand curve, moves the demand curve more like what we saw in point B, and ultimately the profit disappears and we make zero economic profit. Now again, I caution you again, remember that a firm can operate forever with zero economic profit because we've already included a normal profit in our cost curves. So a firm is perfectly okay at zero economic profit. They're just not as happy at zero economic profit. On the other hand, if the firm has an economic loss, as we pointed out a second ago, they're not going to want to do that for very long. In fact, they may not even have the choice of doing it for very long. So through time, firms will exit the market. Sooner or later, they run out of capital and they have no choice. They have to stop doing it. When that happens, customers switch to other firms, which increases their demand and shifts that demand curve up. If you'll remember, in frame A, the demand curve was actually above the average total cost curve, and frame B, it was below the average total cost curve. So as firms leave the industry, as people take their money and invest in projects somewhere else, the demand curve for an individual firm shifts upward and eventually erases the loss. And once again, we get to a zero economic profit. In this case, we're happy to get to a zero economic profit because we did have a loss. So in the long run, what will happen is the firm will produce at a point such that it has zero economic profit and will be at a position such as we see here where the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost is at point A. We go up to the demand curve at point B. We charge a price of P, sell a quantity of Q. We have zero economic profit. We have normal profit only. And that's where we will maintain ourselves through long-run equilibrium. If the demand curve shifts above that, then we make an economic profit and attract other people. If it shifts below that, then we have losses and we ultimately go out of the business, or someone goes out of the business. And so in the long run, what will happen is monopolistically competitive industries will have zero economic profit and will produce at that point and remain there. So how does this compare to perfect competition? In both cases, in the long run, we had zero economic profit. In both cases, we see that the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, the demand curve is tangent to the average total cost curve. What's different, however, is that in perfect competition, that demand curve is a horizontal line. And better still, it happens at the minimum average cost. So remember that when we talked about perfect competition, we said it's both productive and allocatively efficient. That is, it produces the right products and it allocates them to the right people. So from the standpoint of society as a whole, it is absolutely the most efficient way of doing things. We have no wasted resources. We produce exactly the right products and we distribute them to exactly the right people. Unfortunately, in the case of monopolistically competitive firms, however, they face a downward sloping demand curve, and so they don't produce at a minimum average cost. So what happens in these sorts of industries is they have chronic excess capacity. They would be able to produce more, and worse still, if they did produce more, they would produce all of the units at a lower average cost. One of the things that we need to remember is as we move from one point to the other point, that is, as we get greater and greater output, it's not just the additional units that are produced at a lower cost, it's all units that are produced at a lower cost. So as a result, that would actually increase our social welfare. That is, if they were made completely competitive or perfectly competitive, from society's standpoint, social welfare would increase. And just like the monopolists, they produce less and charge more. Now let's look at that graphically. Here we have the two of them side by side, and I always think it's important for us to see the two of them side by side because in so doing we begin to see how they're different and how sometimes you see so many graphs that you kind of get them confused a little bit. In panel A here we have perfect competition. Notice that the result of perfect competition in the long run, both of these are long run graphs. We don't have any variable cost on these. They're both long run equilibrium. In the case of perfect competition, we're producing with zero economic profit, which means that the demand curve, the marginal revenue curve, and the average revenue curve in this case are tangent to it, but notice they're tangent to the very bottom of the average total cost curve. So we've built the best possible plant, the least costly plant, and we're operating it in the most efficient manner. And from society's standpoint, that means that we're using the minimum amount of resources to produce the product. In the case of B, because of the fact that we have a demand curve which is downward sloping, we end up with a marginal revenue curve which is also downward sloping. So you can see that in this case we have here pretty much identical cost curves, and you can see that in the case of a monopolistically competitive firm they actually reduce their output. They could go over to the point where marginal cost intersects with average total cost, but they don't do that. That's not profit maximizing for them. And so as a result, they produce Q prime instead of Q, and they charge a higher price. They charge P prime rather than P. So they raise price and reduce output. You have to reduce output in order to raise price. But the result of it is they still don't make any economic profit. However, what they do is they incur additional cost. It would be cheaper if they operated over at the point where marginal cost intersects average total cost. Not just for the additional products that they manufactured, but for all of the products they manufactured, it would be less expensive. So we see here why it is that we like perfect competition, and it also kind of gives you a feel for why it is that we studied perfect competition. Now again, monopolistically competitive firms are the most frequently occurring. Almost everything that you buy from a monopolistically competitive firm. Any firm that advertises must be monopolistically competitive, or one of the ones that we're going to talk about next time. So it is the most frequently occurring industrial organization. But we can see from this that it's not the most efficient. In fact, perfect competition is the most efficient. Next time we're going to talk a little bit about another type, which is a very frequently occurring market type, but it's a little less fulfilling in the sense of being able to say exactly how they're going to make their decisions. So we'll see you next time.